G'day, this is an intro to a tool called GraphSchema that I'm building to help manage schemas for graph databases. And one of the nice things GraphSchema can do is spin up GraphQL endpoints on top of a Dgraph database backend. So to show that off, I've just gone and Googled for a GraphQL introductory tutorial and cut and pasted the GraphQL schema from that into here, and I'm going to use that as an example. So the schema I found is about authors and posts. So authors have just got a name, and then posts have got a title, some text, and a link back to the author. So there's the two main types of this GraphQL schema, and then there's two auxiliary types, author input and post input, and they're meant to model things we're going to use as mutations to create our authors and posts. And so corresponding to that, there's a mutation type that's got an add author that takes an author input, and an add post that takes a post input. And that's a pretty common thing in GraphQL, to have mutations that expect a subset of your main types as their input. There's also a query type here. So there's two queries: get author, which given the ID of an author gives us the author back, and get post, which given the ID of a post gives us the post back. And so this is a pretty small but standard GraphQL schema. And so to run that up with GraphSchema, we run the init dgraph command, which takes a GraphQL schema file, which is what we've just looked at, and also a connection to a dgraph backend. So if we run that, it goes and creates a dgraph schema that's applicable for this type, which requires a bit of processing, but then it also stores in dgraph enough metadata that it can run up an API, a GraphQL API on top of that dgraph database. So if we run that command and then jump over to Google, so it's spun up an API in the background. And the cool thing about it being able to spin up GraphQL on top of Dgraph is that all the GraphQL stuff just works. So for example, here's a Chrome extension for GraphQL, and that just works now on top of a Dgraph database backend. And if you had one of the JavaScript frameworks for GraphQL, you can just run that on top of this as well. So it just manages all of your data needs for GraphQL, so that you can just concentrate on the GraphQL and not worry about the database. And the cool thing is the database is a nice graph database in the background. So here's one of the mutations from that schema: add author, which takes an author input, which here just needs a name. And so if we run that, what happens is GraphSchema transforms that into a dgraph mutation, runs the mutation, and then gets the result of the mutation and gives us that back here. So it's created a new author with this ID and this name. And then I've been playing around a little bit, so I've got quite a bit of history here. So I've also, as well as an author, I could add a post. So if I use the same author ID as I just got from my previous mutation and add a post with a title of GraphQL in Dgraph and text spin up a GraphQL server with a Dgraph backend, I can run that mutation and it gets me back the title and the text that I just added. So that's the thing that GraphQL allows you to do, is run a mutation and then get back some result as a query after your mutation. But it doesn't just have to be what you added. So for example, we could add another post, which has just got different text this time, and then do arbitrary graph exploration after our mutation. So this one will add a new post, but then do some further graph query after that. So it adds the post, we get our new post title and text, and then it goes back and gets the author as well. So that's translating between GraphQL and Dgraph and doing mutations and queries all in one go. As well as that, we could, for example, get a post. So given an ID of a post, we can get back the title and text. So this is a GraphQL query that gets translated into a Dgraph query, and then the result gets turned back into GraphQL for us here. So this is GraphSchema taking nothing but a GraphQL schema, turning it into an executable API that we can then run both mutations and queries on top of, and it's just standard GraphQL, which is really nice. So we get a GraphQL endpoint with a really nice Dgraph database backend. So that's a really quick introduction to what it can do. And there's a couple more videos I'll show to get a better idea of some of the other features that it has.